The Universal Service Fund has played an instrumental role in getting more broadband to more rural Americans than almost any other government program, including today's BEAD program. But it's in danger, and we're going to be talking about that today on Broadband Action. Today's episode of Broadband Action is brought to you by our friends and C-band broadband backer, Keller and Heckman.
There's a lot of things that make Keller and Heckman uniquely awesome.
It's the hard work, the persistency, representing your client in a fair and honest way. It's taking care of your employees in a fair and honest way.
We are greater than the sum of our parts. We all recognize that we have a very critical role to play for our clients.
We're truly equals in the work together, and we lean on each other for advice. So it's a really nice, equal, deferential relationship that we have with each other.
You see life happening at the same time you're working with people, and that's a unique part of being here.
Keller and Heckman is an international law firm. We are located on 3 continents, including North America, Europe, and Asia.
When we place our flag, whether it's in Brussels, whether it's in San Francisco, whether it's in Shanghai, it's a very unique flag, and it's a reputation that we can promote very easily.
Our guests today on Broadband Action are two people who have swum in the broadband seas for a very long time and understand the Universal Service Fund, or USF, that we are talking about today, and understand some of the issues that are at play here in some court actions that are taking place. Chris Mitchell is with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and Sean Stokes is a partner at Keller and Heckman Law Practice. And we want to thank you both for coming on today to talk about the USF and what its future is going to be. Let's start with the very basics. First of all, Chris, what the heck is the Universal Service Fund?
Well, the Universal Service Fund is an effort at rural equity to try to make sure that people that don't live in cities have decent communications. If you go back to not more than, but 100 years ago, the nation set out to make sure that everyone had roughly equivalent telephone service. Everyone could afford it and have it. Didn't quite get there. There's still some places that had been left behind, but we did a really good job for most people. In 1996, we took away the monopoly system, in which basically you had a monopoly, and where you made a lot of money, you made money, and when you lost money, you made up for it with the money you made in those other areas. And when we didn't have that monopoly system anymore, we needed to figure out people that were running networks in the high cost areas, how would they be able to pay for continuing to build and operate their networks? So we came up with the Universal Service Fund, which basically is a fee that certain services have to collect and then is redistributed in a variety of ways. One of which is to these high cost areas, which is where I think a lot of our focus is right now. But there's 4 Universal Service Fund programs. Along the way, there's a group of people that really didn't like it, and they don't like it for reasons that I would suspect have much to do with their anti-government feeling. They'd rather see private investment and private solutions. And these groups of people have sued on multiple occasions in the courts to try to stop this program. And they finally found a combination of claims that seems to be successful. It was successful in the Fifth Circuit and is now going to be heard by the Supreme Court. So that's when you try to do a 3-minute version of this, like you try to figure out what are the right facts. Those are the ones that I wanted to include.
Well, we certainly don't think that having to summarize this in three minutes is an option. But Sean, maybe you can dig a little deeper, wearing your legal hat here. Give us a little understanding of what this lawsuit is that is currently the Fifth Circuit has elevated to the Supreme Court.
Sure. So as Chris indicated, one of the key issues with the Universal Service Fund is that telecommunications service providers and meaning common carrier telecommunications companies and VoIP providers are the entities that pay into the fund. And the group Consumers Research is the entity that pulled together multiple lawsuits that it fired off in multiple jurisdictions, arguing that the Universal Service Fund and these, in particular, the funding by these carriers was an unconstitutional tax pursuant to an unconstitutional delegation of authority by Congress to an independent agency, the FCC. In other words, that the taxing power comes from Congress, not through administrative agencies, and the argument being that the FCC has been given too much discretion to use this program to impose taxes on private telecommunications providers. And so that's an improper delegation of authority in violation of the Constitution. They also argued secondarily that not only that, but that the FCC itself improperly delegated this authority, to the extent it had authority, to the Universal Service Administrative Company. That's USAC, which is a private nonprofit administrative agency that does the administrative functions of and manages the day-to-day business of the Universal Service Fund, and that was an unconstitutional delegation of authority. And part of this also that they were able to point to, and just real quick and then I'll stop, is that the Universal Service Fund has gone up and up and up over the past 20 plus years, since the 30 years almost since the 1996 Act that Chris talked about first being implemented, to right now, it sometimes is hovering around 33 or 30% of gross revenue. So by any measure, it is broken from that point of view, and that's what they also used as fodder, as just saying they can just tax this any way they want. And that's the 11th Circuit and the 6th Circuit did not agree with these lawsuits, but the 5th Circuit initially a panel of judges did not agree, but they asked for a review of that by the full panel on bank, and throwing a little Latin. And and that circuit said, yes, we believe that this actually is unconstitutional. Interestingly enough, which is what I love, they didn't say that either one of those points that I said, unconstitutional delegation to the FCC or the FCC's delegation of authority to USAC was unconstitutional. They said that even if neither one of those, we don't have to find out whether either one of those is illegal on its face. The fact that they're doing both of these things jointly makes this beyond the pale and therefore in violation of the Constitution.
And how do you think that really holds water legally? Like, how does that work?
That strikes me as a very interesting verbal sleight of hand. You need to prove each one of those things, and then you could add them in together and say, yes, that they violated A and they violated B, so it's even worse that they're doing both A and B. But if A is not a problem, but B is, then maybe the answer is you remand it back to the FCC, the court, and the FCC has to not do it through USAC or rein it in. If A is illegal, then maybe you don't need to get to the question of USAC. But to say that we don't have to rule on either, but just the fact that both of them are happening is improper. I don't. The logic, there's some missing steps there.
What do you think's going to happen? Sorry.
I think that there's a good chance that it'll actually go back to the 5th Circuit and saying that you missed some steps here, so they don't even have to rule on that first part. Second part, I do think that I think there would be a desire, particularly from the institutionalists of the court that are still there, to say this has been in effect for quite some time, and Congress did give sufficient authority. Basically, without getting into the weeds, Congress can delegate authority. They just need to give what's called intelligible principles for the agency to exercise their administrative authority. And so really the question here is, were they given sufficient guidance to know what to do? And it's pretty late in the day to all of a sudden to be coming back 30 plus years and say they were never given this authority. But I suppose you could do, split the baby and say, okay, maybe it's legal, but the way the FCC's delegated its authority is improper, and in which case the FCC would have to figure out whether it still goes through USAC.
But essentially, you're saying you don't think it's going to be a settled matter after
Oh,
March.
if I had to put money on something, it would be that come August, we still won't have much of an idea what the future of USF is.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And
So
I don't think.
I think
Go
it's worth. There's a point that I just have to throw out there, which is that
please.
it is supremely ironic to me that it is the same people who are saying Congress has this power and it cannot give it to the executive. Those same people for the past month have been arguing the executive has all of the power in the world and can do anything that it wants to. And I don't know how you reconcile that, except for the classic sort of, heads I win, tails you lose kind of argumentation. And that's not the way the courts are supposed to work. The courts were supposed to be above that.
And the FCC being part of the executive.
Right. So for people who aren't super schooled on this, the FCC is a independent agency under the executive branch, is a part of the executive branch. And I am super interested in Congress taking more control over a lot of things and having more asserting itself. Like I'm down for that argument among those who would want to make it. However, the solution that is proposed by Senator Ted Cruz, who is very influential on what Congress does on this, is that the Federal Communications Commission would no longer be able to collect these revenues, and that instead it would be congressional appropriations. I think that is a recipe for a disaster. And
it throws it right into the budget cycle and the political tides for always for services that need to happen every single day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and think about that's the ability of Congress to react and predict what those costs are going to be. I mean, think about the Affordable Connectivity Program. That seemed like a big chunk of money, and went away so quickly. The other part about this, ironically, I think, is that I'm old enough to remember when not all of telecommunications law was actually political. There was a lot. You couldn't necessarily know where someone came down on some of these issues by their political stance, because things like Universal Service Fund actually, as Chris indicated, were primarily aimed at providing rural constituents access to communications capabilities, which often tend to be in more red areas of the country. And
that's
so
what I find confusing.
This was not something that was a harebrained scheme by liberals to get communications out there.
Has anyone involved in the lawsuit? I'm assuming the answer is no, but to me it seems like, has anybody thought about what the implications are if the USF goes away? We all agree it needs to be fixed. It's needed to be fixed for a long time. There's no doubt about that. But by breaking it, destroying it, does anybody understand the implications fully? And are they prepared to deal with the ramifications if it does happen?
I can describe some of them because I have been giving this thought, particularly around the high cost fund.
Yeah.
So the way the high cost fund works is basically the federal government signs a contract with you, for instance, relating to the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund set up by the Trump administration. And they say for the next 10 years, every month, we're going to make this payment to you. And then an ISP, a rural telephone company in most cases here, goes to the banks, goes to the federal government and gets funds that it will repay with the federal support from the high cost fund, from the Universal Service Fund. And so these rural businesses, and I'm assuming that we're talking about low hundreds of numbers of loans, mostly to the federal government or banks that are sort of like public or nearly public banks like CoBank, I'm assuming. So if the USF stops making payments, those monthly payments to those rural telephone providers, they are then not able to continue paying their employees, making payments on the loans, and the federal government will suddenly have many tens or low hundreds of non-performing loans to deal with, and this could be very bad. So I mean, that's just one aspect of one program.
Yeah, and it could long term have a great deal of rate inflation on rural broadband services, right? If the subsidy support that has been keeping those rates affordable for so long go away, those rates are going to have to go up, and suddenly people in rural areas are going to be paying a heck of a lot more for broadband than they do now.
This might be a wander into like not conversational territory, so we can walk right back out of it. But we have a new system in place to affect government efficiency, a small agency or group within the government that's operating with relative autonomy, and whose stated purpose is to, quote, cut 10 to 35% off the top and see what happens. Now, without politicizing it, I can't help but think about what cut 10 to 35% off the top and see what happens really means. But I would venture that this is one of the most clear-cut examples of a bad idea to just cut it off and see what happens. It's not as nebulous as maybe some options or choices in that realm. But I think just to address what you said, Chris, this absolutely will have instant effects, not just for the rural end users, but it'll ripple throughout the entire fiscal system.
I think that's right. And because, as Chris mentioned, there's these different pools or programs that are funded by it, and some of them, because they have entirely different names, some people don't even realize that, no, that's still funded through universal service,
like E-rate.
E-rate. CAF2, Connect America Fund, is universal service funds. RDOF came from all these things. And the other part about it is, by and large, the majority of recipients of these funds are private companies too. Right. This is not, again, these are not, it's not like it's only going to municipal systems or co-op systems. It is a private, it's often it's smaller ISPs, it's small independent local exchange carriers. So there's a lot of issues on it. And that gap, if you were to just shut it off, what happens then? I have no idea. And as I said to some of you earlier, I don't even want to predict what it actually legally means about the fact that people that have already received it, I got to believe that there wouldn't be a take back. I'm not suggesting that, but it raises all sorts of philosophical questions. The other thing I think I'd be interested what you all think about it is there's also been Chris talked about one thing that Senator Cruz has talked about for reforms, but there's also other reforms that are more closer in about like, well, what if you expanded it to include broadband providers and things like that?
Yeah, so there's I think two camps. Well, there's probably more than that, but two that come to mind immediately. One is let's expand it to those who have an ability to pay, which is Facebook, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, perhaps Netflix, some threshold of very high revenue companies that derive a lot of it through some form of digital advertising or digital content delivery, and creating a very small tax on them that would, what we call in government, broaden the base. And so we can have a much lower tax on a broad set of assets that would bring in enough revenue to continue the program. And then there's the other idea, which is, well, let's just make it across all communication services. So not Google's revenues or Amazon's revenues, but just anyone that has a broadband connection. Maybe you pay $1, $3 a month. That's the order that we're talking about. And your bill will go up that. I mean, most people get their service from a national cable monopoly like Comcast or Charter or someone like that. Their bills go up every year, $3 to $4 anyway. And so this would actually be for a good cause to make the fund usable. But anytime you talk about increasing taxes on anyone, then it's a political fight.
But well, I wonder if there's
now are such that, especially if that funding is going to go to, it's the whole haves versus have-nots. I have broadband. Why should I pay anything? So they chose to live out in the middle of the boonies. It's not my problem that they can't afford internet now. So don't make me pay for somebody to live in the boonies.
On the other hand, there's an opportunity to message the fact that if that is the amount of money, funds that are required, that spreading it out over a broader set of entities could reduce the burden on all. So, I mean, there are ways I don't know if any of them will be heard, but
Well,
there are ways to message this whole thing more universally. It just seems like right now the mic is owned by people who, just want to execute the USF. And
Well, so I'm not a lawyer, and so I want to hear what Sean thinks about this. But my understanding is that if the Federal Communications Commission decided that it wanted to broaden the base just to broadband providers, and this is assuming that internet access is a Title II service. We're not going to get into that, I realize. But assuming that broadband was eligible to be included in this umbrella, the FCC could make that determination itself without action from Congress. The Federal Communication Commission has refused to really contemplate this, and I think Chair Rosenworcel under the Biden administration insisted that Congress had to act. I do think that Congress would probably have to act if we wanted to go so far as including Facebook, Amazon, and others.
Yeah.
But this gets to a different issue of who has to do something, and I've been frustrated that the Federal Communication Commission hasn't done what it can do, rather than just waiting forever for Congress. I'm not super impressed with Congress, not for a while. And so it's not surprising they haven't fixed this.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there are ways that the FCC could potentially bring in broadband providers. I mean, it's historical that if because of where we are now, if they originally in 1996, back when internet wasn't really mentioned in the Communications Act very often, if at all. And so when they were coming up with these processes, it focused on Title II telecommunication services, which they actually said not just telecommunications services, but also telecommunications itself, meaning private carrier is also included. And then they've included for decades now VoIP, even though they've refused to say what VoIP is, but they've said, well, whatever it is, you're going to, because it is a substitute service for voice service, you're going to pay into universal service for it. So broadband, and I'm not advocating one way or the other because my clients are kind of all over the board on it, but and I know it's a third rail that nobody wants to be the first one to raise their hand to it, but broadband includes transport, which is telecommunications. It's really just the end part where people get argued about, what's doing. And so that it is a really interesting question, because if you talk to people that look at universal service or how they structure their businesses, they twist themselves into knots to avoid providing services that could be classified as being subject to USF payments, and it goes to everything that they offer or how they build things. And it's talk about situations where you say that regulation should not shape the way business decisions are made in this sense, in a granular sense, in a free market economy type thing. It's like, well, you've got a set of rules here now that people really they structure their business around things that they wouldn't otherwise do, but for the fact that they don't want to pay, I don't blame them, 33% of gross revenues on something. So yeah, I think that it would be worth. I think that the FCC could do it. I do think it's interesting, as you said, Chris, that even last year when the FCC had reclassified internet service as a telecommunication Title II telecom service, they specifically said, however, we're not going to require them to pay into universal service.
They were doing that to try to head off the conflict, but that didn't head
or
off.
punt it down the road.
Yeah, well, yeah.
I was going to say, do you think there was maybe some conscious thought about laying the groundwork there, but just not taking all the steps? Do you think they were safeguarding it potentially against, future insulation? Or do you think it was just the job not finished or something else?
I have a lot of trouble assigning any level of strategy to the previous Federal Communications Commission. I think they were just thinking short term of whatever would get the immediate job done.
Yeah.
I did not get any sense there was a larger picture there. I mean, the failure to deal with ACP, which is relevant because we see what happens with an appropriations program that is deeply needed by 20 million American families, and how it just gets turned off. So the Federal Communications Commission actively decided not to have a strategy around that. And so I just feel like we haven't been sending our best, I guess I would say, to the Federal Communications Commission. I say that knowing that some of these people are really spiteful now on both sides.
Well, we all tried to get Ms. Sohn on there, and unfortunately, that didn't work out for her or us. But
No, but she was brave to be our canary in the coal mine for what the future holds. So
yeah, she really was. I mean, a lot of what you're seeing now, she experienced firsthand, and at our spring summit last year, shared her experiences with people, and she was accused of being political. I'm like, well, that's the process. You can't say that it's not political when it's political. I mean, it's always been political, but now it's partisan political more than
I do want to say, like, I mean, I think if we're talking about USF, Curtis, I think you made the point that people don't want to see their tax dollars going to someone else. And I do think that's a part of it, but I don't think it's necessarily a selfishness that's motivating that. I think that a lot of it is people are willing to pay if they believe it's going to a good cause.
Sure.
I think her name's Vanessa Williams. Brookings has done a ton of work on deep surveys and trying to understand Americans' feelings about taxes. And I think what happens is people hear about the abuse and the fraud of some small group of companies that is abusing the program. I think the federal government does a poor job of designing programs that can be easily complied with and also make it harder to defraud. But the simple truth is that nobody ever sees the successes, right? I mean, when the two little girls are sitting outside the Taco Bell doing their homework, everyone sees it. When hundreds of other kids are at home with internet access, nobody sees them. And there's a real problem among people, I think, to help people appreciate what these programs mean. And I think that's a failure of communications that, I could say everyone should do better, but frankly, those agencies, Congress needs to do better at helping people appreciate that even if there is some small level of fraud, the overall benefits to society are so great. Even as we try to combat the fraud, the program is worthwhile and needs to continue.
Well, I think that some types of fraud are more acceptable to people than other types. The types that allow them to do what they want to do are acceptable. Types of fraud that don't allow others to do what they need to do are not acceptable. So,
well, anyone with the Bible knows that's been going on for a minute.
Yeah, this is so true. This is so true, and probably tale as old as time. We won't get into whether we can change that or not. I want to just bring up real quick in our remaining time here. What if? Okay, let's say this whole thing gets broken. All right, one way or another.
Broken.
Is
that a legal term?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
At some point, don't we as a nation need to take another look at that? We're operating under a Telecommunications Act that was written before the thing that we use the most was even in existence. And it itself is based on a law that was created in 1934. Don't we as a nation owe it to ourselves to take a better, harder look at modern policy regarding broadband and all these other technologies before AI, takes over and writes all the laws for us?
I'm just going to quip before the real experts get into the conversation and say that very many statutes and precedents that we operate our nation on now are from laws, court cases, court decisions, and even constitutional amendments that barely apply to the culture and the nation that we live in now. So where do we start the code, massive code cleaning?
Well, I don't think we want to call for a constitutional convention because we all know that might not go very well. But it is the Telecommunications Act is 1996, right?
Yep.
Yeah, it's so outdated. Has there ever been any serious attempt to say let's open up the hood here and give this sucker a tune-up?
There have been efforts, but there's never been a concerted, realistic effort, put it that way. And particularly to your point that it is still set up with these arcane titles.
Yeah.
And stovepipe structures that you're a cable operator, you're a telecom service provider, you're this. And even then they knew the going in proposition was that they wanted the bells were being broken up and you wanted these different companies to be able to provide all these different types of services. And yet they still classify themselves as one or the other. based on the almost branding more so than anything else. But then that drives their regulatory structure and parts of their business. VoIP is the perfect example of that to me. That they won't say what the FCC won't say what it is, but they say, but we're nevertheless going to treat it like a telecom service. And certainly customers think that it's a telephone service. And yet there's all these other types of things that you can't touch on it because it's not a telephone service. It's a service over a broadband platform. And what that means, wasn't anticipated. And yet we're not going to go back and create a new statute to address it.
Yeah, and I think I have like a lot of concerns about both a constitutional convention and a rewriting the act. At the same time, there's never a point where we're not going to have those concerns. Like there's a question of just whether are we going to do it, and we're going to do trade-offs and figure out, who's going to win some and who's going to lose some on different issues. But I think it seems unlikely to me that that's going to happen in the near future. And I think what we need to focus on is what problem are we solving? And, when I look at E-rate, I think when it comes to like schools and libraries, if they're massively overpaying because they don't have an incentive because the federal government's writing the check and they have an inefficient connection, it frustrates me as a person who just wants good, effective, financially responsible government, and so we need people, I think like us and nonprofit organizations and others to be looking at that and trying to expose it and talking about solutions. When it comes to like trying to solve low income internet access, it's a really hard question. And I think the single hardest thing to do is to deal with the single family home that cannot afford decent internet access, because we have a broken market, right? So most people paying $90 a month or so for internet access. If you break it out, it's on that. If you look at surveys and from cities that are looking at alternatives and everything, that's not what anyone else in the world pays, right? Like we have this system that is like grossly inefficient and expensive. My organization, you all, as a Community Broadband Networks Action Network, we have a common set of solutions, but fundamentally, almost every other issue we have like this has been resolved by having a monopoly service territory and then having some level of regulation. I don't think that's where we're going with internet access. And so we need to push forward with some other kind of solution. And I think that means that in 5 years, we're not going to have a comprehensive solution no matter what. We're going to have some areas that have it better than others. And if you're living in the wrong place, you're going to be struggling without internet access, or more likely you're going to have it 1 month and not the next month and going back and forth. But I think we're going to keep muddling through this for a while still until we take it more seriously.
Well, I totally agree with you. Maybe I'm being just a little altruistic to think that a governmental body right now that can't do simple things can do hard things. So maybe it would be definitely a bridge too far. But a guy can dream, can't he?
Sure.
I guess that's.
But I mean, the question is, what would we have them do, right? I mean, I both
That's
want
actually the question.
I want the Affordable Connectivity Program to continue, and I also want them to cut off all the wireless providers in it. Not all the wireless, the mobile wireless scamsters that are a significant percentage of it. I'm frustrated to see all this money going to Charter Spectrum for a service that they're basically breaking even on. I'd rather see that money going to a long-term solution. And so even I am in this situation that I decried of others, which is that like, I want to make all the rules, and I want to make them benefit my friends and the things I like, and I want to make them disadvantage the ones I don't like. And so to some extent, like I'll say, like, we can say Congress should do a better job, but I mean, for me, I am at peace with my strategy of, we feel like communities need to get involved because there is no larger federal solution. A financially responsible federal solution of subsidy is impossible to imagine right now. I think we can have an inefficient solution that throws money at people who don't need it for service that might be crummy, or we can have nothing. And right now we have nothing.
I think that's a great place to land the plane, Chris. And it's certainly
that's a terrible place to land the plane. You should let me.
But it actually does
the
queue
message
up
is
a
good.
potential next conversation, not for today, but our next conversation of, well, if it falls apart, what will we do?
Yeah.
because that's what we, you know, when we sit out here in the boondocks, and if when we sit out here in any underserved community, or fill in the blank, we always have to pick up the pieces, and we always so far have done so. And I'll even toss in that maybe part of the reason that it is not seen as the crisis that people closer to it see it is because there is an assumption that we'll adapt, that the marketplace will create an adaptation. But that, you know, maybe after the March ruling would be a great time to circle back and say, okay,
Yeah.
now what?
I was just going to say that. And also, when will we know? We know that the court's going to hear it in March, but do we know
They said
when?
mid-June, I think.
I'm calling June 26th. I'm just going to
Okay.
make that up.
Okay.
We're going to find out June 26th.
Let's throw
Is that
it.
the last day of court decisions for the term?
No, usually it's right before the 4th holiday, I think.
Okay.
The July 4th.
Yeah.
Is that right, Sean?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
John, Sean, what's your prediction? June 26th on Chris.
I hope it's not a weekend. I'll totally lose.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they'll save it towards the very end of the term. And I also think that it'll be a pretty fascinating oral argument to listen to some of the questions, because it could be one of those ones that they get into the weeds on the technical stuff, but it could also be ones where there's a lot of interesting grand political views on display, because this is one of those ones that is ripe for posturing in a lot of ways. That could be it'll be good theater. I'm not saying it's good.
We've got lots of postury people who will be in the room for that. So
yeah.
I mean,
well, and it's an opportunity for those of us who didn't always agree with Justice Scalia to quote him, because on telecom he was often pretty decent.
Right.
Yeah,
well,
he was, and almost refreshingly decent.
Well, you know, the only other thing I was going to mention about is there's just a slew of parties that filed an amicus in this, and this is not industry versus public sector. You know, by and large, industry is also saying, what, you know, this. We don't like it, but it's we don't like it that we understand. You can't just, you know, it is interesting the way this one is shaking out, and who supports it and who doesn't. If you're tallying up the politics parts of it and the dollar amounts and everything else, it's not as clear which way they're going to go from something like that in terms of the signals that's being sent.
Yep. Yeah, we're fine. We're really as a nation doing a deep dive on the exploration of the idea that we're really discovering a lot of how not all things that are political are partisan. When we start to pull apart our institutions and we find who supports and who doesn't, it is politicized almost always, but it isn't always where you expect.
Right.
And with that, we're going to bring things in for an ending on this topic. Grab your popcorn, everybody. It's going to be interesting to watch what happens in the Supreme Court, if anything, when the decision's handed down and the implication it has for everybody in this broadband industry. Our great guest today, Christopher Mitchell. He is with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. As always, Chris, thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Sean Stokes with Keller and Heckman, a C-band broadband backer, and we appreciate your support of C-band year-round. And my co-host, John. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us on this edition of Broadband Action.